Hello, everyone. My name is Cristopher Hernandez, and today I'm going to be presenting to you about protecting brainwave data when it's used as a modality for biometric authentication. Hence the title of my poster, Can You Read My Mind? Brainwave Biometrics as Privacy Risk. So, as I'm sure we're all aware, biometrics have become more and more ubiquitous as time has gone on. Our phones, for example, have biometric sensors in them, and we can use our biometrics in the case, for example, in the case of our phone, we could use our fingerprint or our face to log into the actual device itself. Or for services like Google, there's now passkey where you can sign in to those services as well using your fingerprint or your face, for instance. So biometrics have become more and more common. They're all over the place now. In one particular biometric modality that has gained interest and research is EEG data. So this is brainwave data. Brainwave data has become interesting for a couple of reasons. One is that in the triad of factors for authentication, something you know, something you have, and something you are, brainwaves feel like a very natural choice for that something you are factor. After all, what could be more unique than how you yourself think, what your thought processes are, how your brain works? So that feels like a natural sort of unique attribute to yourself. So it follows that you could use that to sign into things or authenticate yourself against a service. Not only that, but for high security applications or applications that are based on brain-computer interfaces, using EEG is appealing because you can do continuous authentication. As long as you're using that system, you can keep checking, is this still the person who should have access to that data? And you can revoke access when it seems that that person has left or they are no longer using that system. So there's appeal there for the application of EEG data as a way to authenticate people to services. However, this comes with privacy risks. After all, EEG data is used in medical context, so it shouldn't come too much as a surprise that this information is potentially private. It has a lot of private data associated with it. If you have access to raw EEG data, you can analyze it and potentially learn traits about the person that data came from. For instance, you can learn their gender identification. You could learn their health status, potentially if they suffer from any mental conditions or what their mental state is currently like. You can gain insight into the actual person that data came from if you have access to it and you can analyze it. Not only that, but as generative AI has become more powerful, it is now possible to train models that will generate artificial EEG data, which would potentially render these systems ineffective if they were able to be trained on your EEG data. So this was previously thought to be not possible in this field, as it was seen, the EEG data was seen as being very difficult to spoof or create fake signals that were convincing. However, it's now proving to be easier to do that because you can train models that will generate some reasonably convincing data and potentially allow you to log in as this user if the system was using EEG data for authentication purposes. So this brings us to my analysis here of how or why we need to further protect this data. So when we look at biometric systems, they all generally follow a similar overall architecture. There's kind of 4 phases. There's a collection phase where there's a biometric sensor. You present your biometric. In the case of EEG data, that biometric would be collected using something like a headset, as you can see in that photo below, where there's that person wearing a headset and some goggles. That could be one way that the data is presented, quote unquote. In the case of a fingerprint, it would just be you presenting your fingerprint to the sensor. Then there's a processing step where that data is maybe pre-processed. There's features extracted potentially. There's some initial analysis done. Then there's a classification step where a kind of matching algorithm or a machine learning model, as is particularly common for EEG data, will analyze the information and classify whether that person should be authenticated or not. And then finally, there's response step where there's actually the decision made, is this person authenticated or are they not? And that is presented back to the user, or they are presented with access to the system. But because all these biometric systems follow a kind of similar architecture, there are some common vulnerabilities that we need to consider in pretty much any biometric system, which includes EEG data. So there's presentation attacks, for example, wherein essentially the biometric data is replayed. So in the case of a facial scanning system, for example, you would have like a photo of the person. Maybe you use the photo, present that photo, and it's like you're essentially presenting presenting the biometric, even if you aren't the actual person that the biometric came from. And that is meant to trick the sensor into presenting that data back to the matching system and giving you access. There's template reconstruction, wherein if we're given enough information about the biometric, if we have enough access to it, we can essentially rebuild the original data. So we could reconstruct the EEG patterns essentially, or at least get reasonably close so that we can learn about that original data or potentially use it to log into the system, or train a generative AI model, for example. There's brute force, of course, is a pretty well-known attack for any system. This one's pretty straightforward. It's just trying every combination of data until the system tells you, hey, you've been granted access. This also kind of goes hand in hand with template reconstruction, because if you try enough times and you get a positive response, that tells you, hey, I've got something reasonably close to what the real thing looks like. And then lastly, there's a linkage attack. So the linkage attack is essentially when you have received enough information about the biometric that you can reveal traits about the original user, or you can connect that data to the identity of the original user. So this is particularly interesting for the purposes of this poster, because that's where the big privacy violations come in, because you've essentially identified the original user using the biometric data. And not only that, but we also want to consider standard vulnerabilities that you'd see in any kind of networked application. There could be misconfigurations in the database, for example, or there could be man-in-the-middle attacks. Things of that nature are always a concern with these kinds of systems as well. They're not immune to those. So in order to address all these potential vulnerabilities, what we need is a defense-in-depth mindset. So we can't just rely on one defensive measure. We can't just rely on a web server with HTTPS, for example. That's not enough. We need multiple measures for sensitive information like this, so that if one is defeated, the attacker doesn't immediately have access to the EEG data. They can't immediately start analyzing the data or train a model or learn about the original person. They can't immediately do that. And this takes me to my recommendations here. Is one of the best ways to protect this kind of data is using using that data in an encrypted state or in a transformed state, rather than operating on the original information. So if you do it this way, then if the attacker were to ever gain access to the information flow, they don't get the original EEG data. They get either encrypted information or they get some transformation of it that is not easily analyzed, or they need to do additional work to try to gain access to it. And hopefully they aren't able to gain access to it. And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of these systems are heavily based on machine learning. There's a lot of machine learning models that have been developed to analyze EEG data and identify users and authenticate them, things of that nature. Because of this, a natural fit is homomorphic encryption. So homomorphic encryption is a type of encryption wherein certain mathematical operations can be performed on the data while it's encrypted. So it doesn't need to be decrypted. There's three types. There's partial homomorphic encryption, wherein one type of mathematical operation is allowed unlimited times, so you can continuously operate over the encrypted data without concern. There's somewhat homomorphic encryption, where there's a limited set of mathematical operations that are allowed, and those operations can be performed a limited amount of times. And this is typically because the ciphertext will grow in size as you perform those operations. And after a certain point, the size becomes untenable. It becomes too large to actually operate on in a reasonable time frame. And so that functionally limits the operations that you can perform. Then lastly, there's fully homomorphic encryption, where you have unlimited access to mathematical operations over the data, and there's no limit to the number of times you can operate over it. So naturally, that last type of homomorphic encryption is a perfect fit for machine learning models. You can encrypt your data and process it using that model entirely encrypted, and potentially even offload the processing of that data to some third-party service and not have to worry as much about whether that third-party service may accidentally or purposefully expose that information because it's encrypted. And even if they're processing that data, they don't actually have any visibility into the original information. Now, this type of encryption doesn't come for free, though. It does add an additional layer of complexity, for one thing. To get the best security here, what we really want is for every user to be able to encrypt their own data. So in that case, we've got a layer of key management that has been added to our authentication scheme. So every user, in addition to having their biometric, would have a key that they're using to encrypt their data before they send it off to a server for processing. And in addition, some implementations of homomorphic encryption also have an additional evaluation key that is used for the service to actually run their mathematical operations over the encrypted data. So in that case, you've got another key that you've got to share with the service so that they can actually operate on the data. So that adds complexity to the key management. So that obviously makes it more difficult for us to implement our authentication schemes. And it also adds potential for keys to be lost or keys need to be rotated, things of that nature. So that adds additional work for us if we're going to implement these types of biometrics, in particular EEG biometrics in our systems. And not only that, but fully homomorphic encryption is still an active area of research. It's by no means fully mature. For instance, the original implementations of homomorphic encryption from the late 2000s essentially used what's called a bootstrapping procedure, wherein as the ciphertext grows, because as I mentioned, somewhat homomorphic encryption grows the size of the ciphertext with each operation. As that ciphertext grows, essentially before it reaches that terminal size, a bootstrap procedure is applied, which will reduce the size of the ciphertext so that we can continue to operate on that data. That works well enough to give us the effect of fully homomorphic encryption. However, that creates a performance bottleneck because we've got to always be doing this bootstrap step when our ciphertext is starting to grow. So for that reason, there are some homomorphic encryption implementations that are not very performant. So it requires a lot more computational power to actually run our machine learning models over this data. So that's another concern that we want to keep in mind if we're going to apply homomorphic encryption to EEG data in order for us to safely authenticate our users. However, given the fact that a lot of EEG biometric systems in research have been based on various machine learning implementations, homomorphic encryption seems to be one of the best ways to solve this problem of privacy risk when it comes to EEG data. Thank you. That's my presentation.